Hello again. We're back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, the co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Excited to welcome Chris Morris today. He's the leader at InflectionPointe Consulting. Chris, great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for James. I appreciate it. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. Chris has lots of experience building out the RevOps foundation, both in his consulting, but also kind of in-house at a bunch of early-ish stage companies, or at least early from a RevOps maturity perspective. Have a lot of folks who are kind of solo RevOps folks kind of walking into new jobs a lot. So I think this will be pretty topical. We'll dive into building that foundation and some best practices and learnings. But first, Chris, do you want to share your background in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been kind of in the RevOps, sales ops world for the last 15 years. Kind of fell into it from early on doing more operational stuff. Sales ops wasn't a thing at the company I was at. It was a startup supporting nonprofits, more of a donor management system, and started taking on some of the responsibilities, and then grew from there into more of a sales ops role, and then evolved into RevOps. Certainly was kind of a task taker in my early career. I became more of that consultative business partner later on, and the last really 5 or 6 years have been going into startup type environments, whether that was true startups or whether that was larger companies that were optimizing a specific division within their company, but either optimizing their revenue operations, which didn't have much build up yet, or completely building it up from the ground up. Certainly learning each time, and different revenue models, different industries, gleaning from each one, understanding the nuances, and applying those kind of as I go. Not necessarily a rinse and repeat, but certainly things that I can continue to apply as I've moved on in my careers.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about RevOps is there's so many flavors of it, scopes, different types of business models, that it is kind of just like a stacking of knowledge over time, right? It's never kind of fully complete.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, when the way the environment's changing now with technology and AI, it's certainly never complete.
100%. Well, let's dive into it then. So maybe just starting like at the highest possible kind of altitude, like talk me through like your general framework for building out the RevOps foundation in a company that is kind of less mature on the RevOps front. Like any mental models or kind of things you think about when you step into that.
Yeah, I mean, first thing I do is just go in and diagnose, assess current state, understand what they're using, what tech they're using, what their buyer's journey looks like, and specifically kind of understanding what expectations are versus what reality is in the go-to-market process. There's a lot of shadow processes that happen that leadership may or may not be aware of, some of them are you can glean from and apply it across the board, and some of them are just because they don't have another route, they don't have another path, there's not a process in place or a tool in place. And so just understanding what current state is to be able to identify some of those, identify the gaps, identify opportunities for optimization, and not rushing in to start changing and building, because you'll end up probably rebuilding and certainly struggling with adoption and the change management side if you go in there like a bulldozer and start just kind of throwing your experience around. So that's the first thing I do, is just diagnose, start to build relationships, start to build that trust, and just start to understand what is it that they do today, what is it the buyers experience, and go from there. Once you have that down, you can start to design and kind of build the roadmap out, identify quick wins, more so for that relationship building, identify those quick wins that can help your sellers save, 20, 30 minutes here and there a day during their processes. They'll start trusting you real fast and opening up more about some of their experiences and their processes. But being able to develop that, to design that in a way that allows you to visualize it and communicate it is going to be huge. And then you can start to collaborate more once you have that built out and start to understand what other needs there may be that aren't current state but are more future state, what the strategy is, and collaborating across the entire go-to-market team, especially if you're able to build out like true visual roadmaps and workflows of that current state and where you're wanting to go with it. So that's the second step in my process. And then it's a matter of building it and deploying it, creating kind of MVPs of certain workflows or certain product changes, process changes, communicating that, identifying champions that can kind of pilot it for you and can champion it across their team to support the change management when the time comes, support that adoption. So kind of those three steps. And then it's a matter of iteration. Once you deploy it that first time, how do you continue to optimize on it? Find other ways that it can support other functions, other steps along the buyer's journey. And it's a never-ending journey as it relates to optimizing the go-to-market functionality, especially as companies continue to evolve and change their product offerings or their strategies. Then you have to be able to pivot and optimize with it.
That's great. I love the framework. We almost had an alliteration, for lack of a better word. We got diagnose, design, deploy, iterate. So maybe we got to find a word that starts with a D for iterate. But I think that's a great way to think about it. You started off on kind of like the diagnose piece, which I think is so important. We've heard so many other great RevOps leaders mention this as well. Starting by understanding the buyer journey. Like when you come in, like how can you kind of best understand the buyer journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to understand it, one, because your company's purpose should be somewhat driven by the buyer's needs, and the buyer's needs should be reflected in their journey. So starting to understand the handoff process, where does a buyer first enter into your lead flow? Is it through marketing intervention? Is it product led? Is it through website, things like that? Where does that handoff look like when it first gets over to sales? Do you have an inbound team, BDR team? What does that structure look like for your sales teams? How many handoffs are there? How many faces are they having to go through to get to that end result? And then what's the handoff process between sales and CS that are, hopefully supporting that adoption within their company, supporting that value that your company's bringing them, and then ultimately supporting the renewal and retention. That awareness throughout that entire journey is important, because anywhere where there's a breakdown, you're going to lose leads, you're going to lose potential customers, those prospects are going to fall out of the funnel, or you're going to lose retention. So understanding that entire process and how each team handles that part of the buyer's journey, and then again, the transition, those handoffs, it's crucial to be able to optimize anything and have that alignment, because otherwise you're just going to cause more friction within the buyer's journey if you're not fully understanding of the alignment between go-to-market team and departments.
Yeah, that's great. I think I would just kind of like reiterate, because I strongly agree that aligning folks on kind of like definitions of how things are flowing through the funnel and the customer journey is so important to get people on the same page of SLAs and how things should be worked. But then also kind of like the drop off, to your point, of like where are things like leaking out of the process or really suboptimal for the buyer and kind of impacting the bottom line, whether that's on net retention or top of funnel to converting. So I think that's kind of well put.
Yeah, absolutely. And as it relates to the definitions, having a strong enablement process as well throughout to be able to educate and train on those definitions, especially if you're having to align some that are currently mismatched. Having that strong enablement, whether that's a dedicated enablement team or within RevOps, having those skills, because that's not something that I've done enablement in the past. I wouldn't consider it my strong suit, but I have the ability to do it. But it takes a little more time for me to make sure to include that in my process as I'm aligning all the different teams within go-to-market. So.
For sure. Yeah. So just to kind of cap off the customer journey piece then, how does it change like the actions you're going to take in like the design or deploy phase? Like, is it a prioritization mechanism where it's like, hey, we laid this out and now let's just go tackle the biggest gap? Or like, I guess I'm asking again, like kind of the purpose, what's the action you take with it once you have it documented?
Yeah, I think there's nuances depending on the needs and the maturity level of the organization. There's definitely usually some low-hanging fruit that you can apply and quickly see some dividends from. And if you can do that in a way that, knowing that kind of future state isn't a complete overhaul, then I would typically start with the low-hanging fruit. How can we quickly increase conversion or lessen the overall deal time, create less friction between handoffs, things like that? If you're having to go in and completely establish a true buyer's journey within go-to-market and launch a lot of things, then it might change your approach. But usually there's some quick wins that you can gain some, even if it's a small amount of increased percentage of conversion and things like that. I would start with those. But I would also work with the executive team, understand where they want to prioritize based off of context that maybe you don't have before you started and things like that. But certainly documenting everything, identifying if they have a knowledge base, because that's going to lead into your adoption, that's going to lead into your onboarding and your training, lead into all the enablement. So being able to clearly document everything as you go, whether it's current state or the changes that you're making, have that in a source of truth type of system, Confluence or something of that nature, and be able to drive drive your go-to-market team to that throughout the launch of any changes, and building that kind of discipline for them to continue to go there is going to be huge in your long-term adoption of any changes or strategies that you're making.
Yeah, that's great. Not to mention if you expand the RevOps team as well, so helpful to have all that stuff kind of documented.
Absolutely. That certainly the goal, to continue to scale with the company. Absolutely.
Yeah, you mentioned also in the diagnose phase, kind of like ride-alongs, my words, not yours, but understanding the processes today, call them the actual work being done in the customer journey. You mentioned a lot of like shadow processes, which I think is really great call out because it is so often true and not what people actually think is going on a lot of the times. But like, what are you, as you're looking at these things, like what are you trying to understand when you're looking at their existing processes? Because I think there's more to it beyond just the buyer journey, right?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's things that the shadow processes. There's things that sellers reps do or CS does. More so, I would say, in customer-facing roles, things that they do out of either necessity or because they came from somewhere else where they found success in something that was set up that's not set up here. And so, I'll usually start with diagnosing from an executive level. What do executives expect or think is happening? And usually you'll get certain things where, like, say this is happening, and then they'll kind of take a couple steps back and they're like, well, at least I think this should be happening, and so there's always some hesitation on certain areas of that buyer's journey that when they start to really think through what they think is happening versus what they know is actually happening. And then I start, as you mentioned, those kind of virtual ride-alongs, or maybe physical, depending on the industry that you're in or the sales approach that your company has. Sitting in on those calls, understanding what they do to prep for those calls, what do they do after those calls. Is there automation set up to capture some of that, or are they having to notate everything and manually input it all? What is it they're doing to help themselves push deals along faster? And it's those things that typically aren't documented, typically aren't built into any sort of process. It's usually your higher performers that have a lot of that knowledge, either from past jobs or maybe from just finding success within that company, and identifying what can be repeatable, what can be gleaned from that can be repeatable across the entire organization, and what can be done through automation and tools that maybe just aren't in place today. So there's always a lot of gems, especially again with the higher performers and what they're doing that's not currently set up in place, or maybe what they're doing outside of expectations. And maybe it's a matter of changing the expectations of how the role should be flowing. Not only does it have to be things that you're adding to the process, but maybe the process needs to change because they have found a better way to do it. There's no channel or way of communicating that and then implementing that.
Yeah, and I think that really bleeds into like the design element of this too. So you're kind of diagnosing with some of the processes and then thinking about how do we scale out some of the things that are working well from a design perspective. If we think about like, the companies in the early stages of their RevOps journey, whether that's an early stage startup or just a company that's hiring RevOps for the first time, like anything else you would add on the design side from like a principles standpoint? Like I kind of suspect you're going to say like simple is better at this stage. Maybe that's not the case, but anything else you kind of think about or guide to?
Yeah, I would definitely say less is more usually at this stage. It's a lot easier to add more as you go. It's a lot harder to start to peel away things if you make it too complicated at first. And you run the risk of creating bottlenecks if you overcomplicate validation rules or certain things, especially if it's a manual intervention on their part. You run that risk of them just putting in information just to check the boxes so that they can move the deal along or something of that nature. So I would certainly say less is more as you continue to understand the process, as you continue to understand kind of the overall strategy and vision of the company, to know what your true metrics are that should be being tracked and things like that. Then you can start to implement more detail, more complexity into the overall process. But absolutely, yeah, less is more. Simple is typically best early on in the development and the design process of that before. It certainly creates less friction when you start to deploy it.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that you brought up metrics too, as a founder of a go-to-market BI kind of platform that's all metrics driven. I think you're spot on that like less is more in the beginning. And if we get people in the habit of looking at the couple metrics that actually really do matter, that starts to open up more questions and people then want to dive a bit deeper versus if you throw them a page of 20 different things, it's just going to become noise. And so I think that's really spot on advice. Tell me about culture as well. I think culture kind of bleeds through all of this: diagnose, design, deploy, iterate. I mean, I think we've all experienced various go-to-market orgs that are, I'm trying to be political here, they have different degrees of receptiveness or interest in process structure, data, and the like. As you're coming into a new role, like, how do you assess the culture from leadership, and how does that assessment kind of bleed into how you operate?
Yeah, culture is huge to understand what the best way of deploying things are, how you're going to get best adoption, and things like that. And yeah, to assess that, there's a couple ways that I've done it. I like to talk to teams or individuals on those teams kind of about their collaboration or their integration with other teams. Understand, is there alignment? Is there a lot of blame that's happening? Start to understand how they collaborate and the healthiness of those relationships between different teams, different departments. I like to work with the executive team to understand how decisions are made. I would say most off the bat are going to say that their decisions are made from data-driven insights, but it's not always the case. Sometimes they are, which is great. Sometimes it's more personality-driven. And so starting to understand how their decisions are made, you may or may not be able to change that off the bat. You can certainly always support the data side of things. Doesn't mean it's going to completely change their structure or their strategy of the personality side. Understanding that, overall understanding like how they view processes. Are they a process-driven organization where they find it helpful, or do they have more sales individuals or customer-facing individuals that find processes as sort of a burden, something that just gets in between them and their customer? So understanding some of that, if there's a level of rewards that happen within organizations, whether that's just praise or whether that's some sort of incentivization, understanding how their reward process works, and then ultimately also understanding how conflict is handled. So if you can understand all of those, then you can apply that in your ability to deploy whatever changes you're making. If there is a reward process, have a gift card. Doesn't have to be anything large, or have some sort of announcement of praise when like certain key milestones are hit during that change process. Calls logged in this way, or so many certain particular fields that are wanting to be tracked have been appropriately submitted as far as the information that they're looking for, or something along those lines. Understanding that culture ultimately will help drive how you deploy it, how change management works, their readiness for change, and things like that.
I think those are some really good, actionable, tactical things that you can do for an org to understand how to kind of implement change in the places that are a little bit more, or to say, less enthusiastic about it. So I think that's a really good kind of checklist. My favorite story is we worked with a company and, didn't love following a ton of process, but really competitive sales organization, and just gamifying all this into leaderboards from data hygiene to activity tracked and things like that did wonders, which is so funny, right? To speak to human nature.
Absolutely. If they're a competitive team, which typically sales are, gamification can work really well with adoption. It's just a matter of understanding what types of games that it requires.
Yeah. It's like our old reptile brains can't help it. It's always so funny to me. Okay, so wrapping up here shortly, sadly we're almost out of time. So buy-in I want to talk about as well, because I think that's actually slightly different than what we just talked about in terms of like getting adherence through compensation, rewards, praise, gamification. When you're working with a company that's maybe less inclined to do process for the first time, or implement new friction, I guess, even if it's for the best, like how do you communicate or enable or get buy-in? Because that's kind of a different story, right? Like how are you talking to the go-to-market orgs, whether it's sales, marketing, leadership, folks on the ground, to say like this is actually like worth your while?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's several key factors. Providing autonomy and acknowledgement of their feedback, including them in that diagnosis process, that early phase, I think goes a long way to give them the voice that they want to have. Everyone wants to have that level of influence. Everyone has opinions. Everyone has feedback that they want to provide. So being able to give them that voice, include them in that diagnosis early on. You're not going to be able to include everything. Every complaint can't be fixed through an initial development, or maybe not even at all, depending on what it is. But being able to give them, acknowledge that they have something to offer in the process is going to be great. To a certain degree, we have to be sales individuals as well of our own. Talk more about the outcomes of what these processes are going to provide. Talk less about the features. Features tend to help them or make them think it's extra tasks, extra steps for them. But if you're able to provide the outcomes, that these changes, especially when it comes to like any sort of incentive commission-based role,
Yep.
if the changes you're making is going to impact or increase their money in their pocket, like that's huge. A lot of them won't even care what it is they have to do if it's going to help them convert more, sell,
Say less, yeah.
higher contracts, whatever the case may be. And so, really focusing on the outcomes. If what you're doing has a lot of high cross-functional visibility and impact, that can be, especially from an executive level. Like if what you're doing is positively impacting across multiple teams, you're going to get a lot of buy-in. And I mentioned earlier, finding the champions. Communication kind of from the top down is going to help, but finding the champions on those teams that are being impacted, someone that you can pilot with, get the buy-in early from them, that's going to help them. Not only will it help the rest of the team have buy-in, but it's going to help your coaching. Like they'll be able to coach the other teams. They'll be able to communicate with them in a way that they'll understand better versus maybe what both being new to the organization and also being more operationally minded versus sales minded. It'll help out a lot, or marketing minded, whatever the team may be. Finding those champions are going to go a long way in buy-in across the entire org that's being impacted on whatever changes. And then, like I mentioned, celebrating those early adopters. The case may be through gamification, praise, through I've seen some really interesting ones where if you hit a certain goal, more so monetary goal, if you hit a certain goal, like you get to choose a billboard that you can put in, the company will pay for a billboard and you can put whatever you want on there within limitations, even things like that, like bragging rights, sort of things of that nature. Like, get creative with it, but celebrating those early adopters, it always helps. So
that's great. Chris, this is awesome. We have time for one last question. What did I miss here? What question should I have asked you? Or maybe the easier question for me to ask you is like, any other advice? Is there any other advice you have for folks building out an early RevOps foundation? Any hidden gotchas you've come across, or just anything you'd leave folks with?
Yeah, I think it's I have a lot that crossed my mind. Building trust in various ways, especially when you're new to an organization, especially if you're like a lot of startups are going to be, they're wanting to hire almost unicorn level employees that can do it all, and they're individual contributors. Being very aware of your own capabilities, being very aware to not overcommit. You can still acknowledge, you can still prioritize. It helps to be over communicative on those requests, on those designs. But as soon as you start overcommitting, then you're not able to develop, you're not able to deliver on those timelines. So having a good understanding of where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and being able to really prioritize in a way that makes sense. And you can always adjust your roadmap, your timelines, but as long as you're communicating in a way that is very clear and helpful to typically leadership, in a way that helps them understand like where you are, why things are being delayed, how you're having to prioritize certain things over others. There's always a lot of requests when someone new starts, and understanding your capacity and your skills and communicating in a way that helps them understand that. It'll save you a lot of heartache. It'll save you a lot of late nights trying to build something out because you may have overcommitted. And so that's really it was something I had to learn the hard way for sure. And it's still a challenge from time to time to not overcommit. And especially when I get excited about something, it's something I want to jump right into it if it's a good idea and something that can make a big impact. Especially again, if you're the individual contributor, there's the day-to-day that you have to continue to maintain. And so setting those expectations, those boundaries in a way that is respectful and still productive, it goes a long way.
Well put. Prioritization is the other side of the coin on this whole discussion. Now, there's only so much you can do, especially if you're a solo RevOps person. We've talked a lot about that in past episodes, actually, and you can spend a lot of time with a lot of techniques. But Chris, sadly, we are out of time. But this is awesome. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your learning. This is great.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, James. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing seeing what else you produce on these. It's been great.
Awesome. Thanks.